My name is Olivia Carter. I am 34 years old. I serve as a United States Army intelligence officer. Just take notes, my brother mocked me at the peace talks in the DMZ. The room held cold air and hot lights. Flags stood behind lacquered tables. Translators waited behind microphones. Aides clutched folders. Security watched the floor. I kept my face neutral and my hands still. Across from me, the opposing general placed both palms on the table. His index finger began to tap. The rhythm was too disciplined to be a tick. Short, short, long, a breath, long, short, short. I translated without thinking. Morse, camera, west wall. I leaned toward our 4-star general. I let the words out in a thread. Stay calm. Hidden camera. He did not look at me. He asked for a recess with a voice that did not waver. The request moved through 2 languages and 3 headsets. The general finally turned. He stared at my brother. Ethan's mouth flattened. His eyes dipped. Something in his posture failed. The thought rose clean as a blade. Why would it be my brother? Later, the caption in my head would read, "Just take notes." My brother mocked me at the peace talks in the DMZ. But I saw the enemy general tapping his fingers. It was Morse code. I whispered to our 4-star general, "Stay calm, hidden camera." The general froze. He stared at my brother. My brother's face collapsed, because I had found his treason. But in that room there were only movements to measure. 2 technicians entered during recess. They swept the west molding with an optical wand. The wand paused. A pinhole stared back. A wire slender as a vein ran to a junction box that had no business there. The team documented. The lights stayed polite. When we returned, water glasses and nameplates sat exactly where they had been. The performance resumed as if no hands had touched the stage. I watched Ethan's left thumb tremble once before his palm trapped it. He had teased me that morning in a tone he reserved for family. Now the tone felt borrowed from a stranger. I wrote what I always write. Time, place, anomalies, behaviorals, actions taken. I wrote that the general's cadence slowed after recess. I wrote that the opposing aide touched his earlobe, folded his arms, checked his watch without looking at the face. I wrote that my brother avoided my eyes. Writing is not vengeance. Writing is evidence. That sentence steadied me. I kept my breathing low, 4 in, 4 out. Ethan scribbled. He looked good at looking busy. The meeting wound to a stop. Chairs sighed. Metal scraped marble. In the hallway, he matched my pace. "We should grab dinner, noodles on the corner," he said. I said I needed to review my pages. At the elevator, he leaned against the frame. He said it again. "Just take notes." The doors opened. I stepped inside and nodded. In my room, I set the notebook on the desk and pressed my hand against the cover. Training says the first error is gossip. The second is acting like a hero. I did neither. I opened the window an inch. Neon washed the curtains. I wrote 1 line at the bottom of the page. I will not mistake fear for facts. I will not mistake love for facts. Then I sealed the page with a strip of tape, my ritual when something matters. I stood at the sink, ran cold water, felt it bite my wrists, counted until it went numb. My brother and I share a house and a history. None of that belongs in a report. What belongs are taps on a table, a pinhole in a wall, a tremor hidden by a palm. I shut the water, dried my hands, returned to the desk, and outlined the next decision. I would widen the circle by 1, no more. Facts before grief, process before pride. That was how the night would hold. The table smelled of lemon polish, a scent that tells you how recently a space was touched. I noted the waterline on my glass. Condensation curved like a small clock. Across the way, a translator adjusted his headset. His eyes tracked the general's hand, not his mouth. Details pile up. Later, they arrange themselves. For now, they wait. When the recess ended, I watched the door latch. Brass shivered as if a coin had landed. Training says do not confuse certainty with clarity. I wrote the tap, the glance, the tremor, and let the meaning wait its turn. Outside, sirens faded into traffic. Inside, the carpet carried the weight of boots pretending to be shoes. My pen felt heavier than it should. Duty can add ounces. My name is Olivia Carter. I am a United States Army intelligence officer. I tell stories to paper so commanders can act. When I was 9, rain turned the creek behind our house into a brown river. Ethan crouched and told me to climb on. He carried me across. I felt taller on his back than I ever felt on my feet. When I was 12, he showed me how to tie a square knot and a runner's knot. He said a good knot is a quiet promise. Later, we chose different routes under the same flag. I went to the field. He went to the corridors where decisions are worded carefully. The years moved. My promotions arrived. Ethan smiled and clapped. The smile thinned as the clapping faded. He learned to place a joke between us. Just take notes, Liv. I let the joke live because it kept us from saying harder things. By the time we flew to the DMZ, we had a style for not arguing. We talked logistics and weather. My assignment there was narrow and necessary: observe, record, recommend when asked. I sat behind our 4-star general with a notebook and a steady pen. Before the first session, Ethan tapped my shoulder and offered a canned coffee we used to buy in the field. He said I would need the sugar. Then he added the old line: just take notes. What I saw in that room is in the record: the tapping finger, the Morse, the whisper, the recess, the pinhole. The way Ethan's eyes drifted from mine, as if my gaze were a question he could not answer. What I did not see mattered too. I did not see who hired a contractor. I did not see who signed for a tool chest. Intelligence is a fence line between what you know and what you cannot know yet. When the day ended, I walked the hall beside Ethan. He suggested dinner. I asked for an hour with my notes. The elevator closed. He repeated the line: just take notes. In my room, I set the notebook flat and wrote the day as if I were writing the weather, precise, nothing extra. I added a margin line for myself. I will not mistake fear for facts. I will not mistake loyalty for facts. I tied my laces the way he taught me. The tug steadied my hands. I stood at the window and let the city draw long lines of light across the glass. I thought about calling him. I did not. I counted my breath and let training do what training is for. Widen the circle by one when the time is right. The next morning, I met him in the cafe. He slid a chair out with a small show of manners. The kindness landed next to the ache. On the way to the compound, we rode in silence while the city lifted its shutters. At the gate, the guard saluted. We entered the day that would test our lanes. In the briefing room, I opened to a clean page and wrote a header: limited viewpoint, confirm externally. I listed the observable, the tap, the recess, the camera, the tremor, the glance away. I did not assign motive. I did not invent a story to hold my fear. We grew up in a house where service felt ordinary. Our father ironed shirts on Sundays and told us that quiet work keeps the nation upright. Ethan believed in rooms. I believed in roads. Promotion statistics changed our dinners. We both pretended not to notice. At the DMZ, my tasking order was plain: sit behind the principal, observe without interfering, record behaviorals, flag contradictions after the session. I wrote what hands reveal when mouths are careful, how a smile can arrive late, how a breath can stall before a risky sentence. I am paid to notice when something small tilts the larger frame. Before the morning session, he handed me a canned coffee. It smelled like early buses. He added the refrain: just take notes. After the camera was found, I understood the limits of my lane. I could describe a tap and a tremor. I could not supply a verdict. That night, I wrote a clean account: times and places and actions, nothing of family. I noted my limits. I wrote that my seat gives me a narrow view, that other sources must confirm or deny. In the cafe before dawn, he asked if I had slept. He told a junior officer that discipline is a kindness. The officer nodded. On the drive, the compound rose from fog. The guard saluted. We moved forward. In the briefing room, I set my pen at the margin and waited for the hour to begin. I told myself one thing as the door opened and the general stepped in. Maybe I misunderstood, but facts do not lie. During the first break in the peace talks, I stepped out into the narrow hallway, the cold air from the DMZ seeping through the poorly sealed windows. The room behind us had been thick with tension, military aides whispering, translators flipping pages, and that faint click of a pen that never seemed to stop. One of the tech officers jogged toward me, his face tight. "Ma'am, we found something," he said quietly. He motioned for me to follow. They led me back into the conference room, but not to the table. Instead, we stopped by the west wall, exactly where the Morse code message had pointed. There, hidden behind a decorative panel, was a pinhole lens no bigger than a sesame seed. The wires trailed down inside the wall cavity, disappearing behind layers of wood and concrete. A second tech approached, holding a small tablet. "This feed's not ours," he said, showing me a grainy black and white image. Our negotiating table, from a high corner view. I felt my pulse quicken. "Who had access here last night?" I asked. The lead tech tapped on his tablet. Entry logs show a subcontractor badge. Name, Tara Nguyen, civilian contractor. Accessed at 23:14 hours, stayed for 12 minutes, no scheduled work order. I knew Tara by sight, slim, quick-moving, often blending into the background with her toolkit and calm demeanor. She'd been around for weeks, fixing minor electrical issues. But late-night unscheduled access at the DMZ was a red flag no one could ignore. I turned and scanned the break area. Ethan stood near the coffee table, speaking with a South Korean liaison. His posture was relaxed, but his right hand kept turning his wedding band in slow circles, a tell. He did that when he was under pressure, a habit he'd never broken since our academy days. My mind flashed back to when we were kids, at a cadet summer program before either of us had officially enlisted. I'd been the smallest in our platoon, and some of the older boys thought it was funny to shove me around during field drills. Ethan had stepped between us without hesitation, taking the shove for me. Later that night, he'd sat beside my bunk, teaching me how to lace my boots the real way. "You don't need anyone's approval, Liv," he'd said. "Just do your job and do it better than they ever could." That memory clashed hard with the man I saw now, calm on the outside, but with that restless hand betraying him. The Ethan I knew would never betray his uniform, never betray me, but the Ethan I was looking at was standing 10 feet away from a wall that held a spy camera, one I'd been warned about by an enemy general's coded signal. I told myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe Tara had her own reasons. Maybe Ethan's nervous tic meant nothing. But the facts were stubborn. A hidden camera, a civilian with unscheduled access, and my brother's subtle avoidance of my gaze. As the break wound down, I walked back toward the table, my steps measured. Every soldier learns early that suspicion can rot a team from the inside out. I needed to be sure before I moved a muscle toward action. But the question burned anyway, low and relentless. Was I chasing the wrong person, or was I afraid to face the right one? Back at the hotel, the frost on the window pane reminded me how close we were to the border. The peace talks might have been paused for the night, but my mind wasn't resting. I had barely set my bag down when there was a knock at my door. It was Ethan's aide, a young specialist with the kind of nervous energy you could spot from across a room. "Ma'am, Colonel Carter asked if you could drop this off to him tomorrow morning," he said, holding out a slim black document case. He forgot it in the motorcade. I took it with a polite nod, though the weight in my hands wasn't just physical. This was an opportunity, and a test. If I was wrong about Ethan, this would prove it. If I was right, I needed evidence no one could argue with. From my field kit, I pulled a vial no bigger than a lip balm tube. Inside was a thin, clear fluid that dried to a faint shimmer under ultraviolet light, an invisible tracking ink used in counterintelligence sweeps. I'd used it before to trace the movement of classified materials when we couldn't afford to plant an obvious bug. I slipped on nitrile gloves, dabbed a barely visible crescent mark along the inside flap of the case, and then brushed a second layer across the handle. Under normal light, it looked untouched. Under the right scanner, it would sing like a beacon. The next morning, I handed the case to the aide in the lobby. "Tell my brother I said he's welcome," I said, keeping my tone easy. Then I let the net tighten. 2 hours later, in a quiet cafe across from the ministry annex, my secure tablet pinged. The ink's sensors were live. The case had moved southeast, not toward the DMZ compound, but into a row of mid-rise buildings in the old business district. The tracking overlay showed it stopping in one spot for 37 minutes. I zoomed in on the map. The address belonged to a serviced office suite. My stomach tightened when I saw the reservation records. Booked 2 weeks ago under the name Tara Nguyen. I needed a second set of eyes. I called Lieutenant Lopez from the Joint Counterintelligence Task Force. He'd been my sounding board since I first got wind of possible leaks. His voice came low and steady over the line. If you're right, Liv, you can't take this through the usual channels. Go diagonal, DOJ CI. Keep military CID in the blind for now. Going diagonal meant bypassing the military's own investigative paths and feeding the intel directly to Department of Justice counterintelligence. It was risky. It also meant someone higher up could pull the plug before the evidence saw daylight. I kept my voice even. Copy that. I'll package what I've got. For the next 3 hours, I forced myself to sit still, working on reports while the case's tracking signal went silent, then reappeared. At 19:30 hours, it pinged again, this time back at my hotel. I waited until I knew Ethan was out at a dinner with the delegation before heading upstairs. The case was back in his suite, sitting on the desk as if it had never left. When I asked to borrow it, an excuse about needing to verify the format of the peace talk minutes, Ethan didn't hesitate. Sure, Liv, just bring it back before morning. Inside my room, I scanned the case under UV light. The ink was intact, but I noticed something else. Every sheet inside had been restacked with the kind of precision you only see in training manuals. No bent corners, no shifted alignment. Too perfect. In the field, that level of order was never accidental. Someone had handled these documents carefully, not just to read them, but to make it look like they'd never been touched. That was my spike. Not enough to convict, but enough to know this wasn't just about a forgotten briefcase anymore. Lopez met me in the dim-lit comms room 2 floors below the main conference hall. The space smelled faintly of solder and dust, its walls lined with racks of secured routers humming at a steady pitch. He closed the door behind him, sliding the lock with a practiced flick, and placed a folder on the table between us. Inside was the framework for what he called a logistics ghost, a believable but entirely fabricated movement plan for a supply convoy that, if intercepted, would be too tempting to ignore. We built it line by line, times, coordinates, cargo descriptions. Enough truth to look legitimate, enough fiction to sink anyone who acted on it. I inserted subtle irregularities, a departure time that would make no operational sense unless someone had a back channel to smooth the way. A payload description that was mundane to outsiders but highly sensitive to anyone tracking certain defense contracts. Lopez smiled without humor. If they bite, we'll see the ripple in hours. The challenge wasn't making the bait. It was placing it somewhere Ethan and Tara could plausibly find it, without suspecting we were watching. Too direct, and it would reek of entrapment. Too obscure, and it might never cross their paths. We settled on a temporary email account tied to a rarely used liaison address. It was technically a planning overflow inbox, one that existed for low-priority updates that didn't fit into primary channels. Ethan had access through his clearance, Tara through shared workspace permissions. Neither could open it without leaving a trace. I typed the email myself, keeping my breathing even. Updated movement sequence, for review, sat in the subject line, bland enough to disappear in a busy morning's traffic. In the body, I wrote 2 short paragraphs in the clipped functional style every logistics officer learns. Lopez embedded the tracker, a fragment of code that would ping our secure terminal the moment the message was opened. As I hit send to the overflow inbox, a thought coiled through my chest. If I'm wrong, I've just set a fuse that will burn straight back to my own family. We didn't have to wait long. 3 hours later, in the middle of the second session, my secure phone pulsed once against my leg. Not a message, an alarm. I kept my face still, my pen moving across the notepad. Lopez's voice came through my earpiece with controlled precision. Olivia, the ghost file just got opened. Logging origin now. I noted the time in the corner of my page, pretending to jot a name from the discussion. My pulse climbed, but I forced my breathing into the same slow rhythm I used during weapons qual. Across the table, Ethan was leaning back, one ankle over his knee, a pen tapping against his notebook in an absent pattern. Tara sat angled slightly away, her hand resting on her phone under the tablecloth. Source? I whispered, lips barely moving. Lopez came back after a pause that felt like a full rotation of the earth. Accessed from a terminal in the shared liaison office. 2 active users in the room at the time. Tara Nguyen and your brother. The words landed like ice water down my spine. My pen paused mid-stroke. I forced it back to motion before anyone noticed. A flicker of memory surfaced. The way Ethan had looked at me across the dinner table last Thanksgiving. His smile too quick to fade when I asked about his work. I wanted to look at him now, to catch some micro-expression that would make this clean in my mind. But training overrode impulse. I kept my gaze on the notepad, my ears on the room, my awareness split between the negotiation and the silent detonation happening in my chest. Lopez's voice again, lower this time. We can lock this down now, or we can watch for a follow-on action. Your call. If I ended it here, the case would go to review with what we had. Strong, but not irrefutable. If I waited, we risked losing control, but we might see exactly where the information traveled. In my head, the thought whispered again. If I'm wrong, this is the kind of trap that destroys trust forever. I imagined the look on my mother's face if she learned I'd set bait for Ethan. I imagined the sound of the handcuffs if I was right. I want the follow-on, I murmured. Copy. We'll maintain passive surveillance, Lopez said. But be ready, this could move fast. I slid the pen back into its groove and closed my notebook like nothing had shifted. On the surface, the meeting went on. Maps unfurled, phrases translated, agreements in principle forming. Beneath it, a line had been crossed, and there was no stepping back. I didn't look at Ethan. I didn't have to. Somewhere deep in my bones, I felt the weight of what was coming, and I knew that whichever way this ended, nothing between us would ever be the same. The day began under a slate-gray sky, the kind that pressed low over the rooftops and made every sound carry farther than it should. By 0400, the Joint Command Post was live. Screens glowing, coffee cups steaming. The low murmur of voices in 3 languages weaving a taut net of coordination. DOJ's counterintelligence cell had the lead, but CID, NCIS, and the Korean National Police each had a piece of the board. Every move had been argued, refined, and signed off. Now it was execution. I rode in the back of an unmarked surveillance van, its windows darkened and interior stripped down to comms gear and hard benches bolted to the walls. Through the feed on the center monitor, I could see the warehouse district outside Busan waking slowly, forklifts clattering in the distance, gulls riding the drafts above the harbor. The target location sat 2 blocks ahead, a mid-sized storage facility with a faded blue sign and a habit of receiving more traffic at night than during the day. 2 other unmarked sedans were positioned in the grid around it, no more than 2 streets away in any direction. To a casual observer, they were delivery vans, construction trucks, or just cars parked too long. To us, they were anchors in a closing net. At 0617, Tara appeared on the grainy feed from the alley camera. She wore a dark windbreaker and carried a messenger bag slung low against her hip. Her pace was brisk but not hurried, her eyes flicking to the corners of the street like she was checking for traffic. She approached the side door of the warehouse, the one shielded from the main road by a stack of rusting shipping containers. The camera zoomed in just enough for me to see her hand dip into her jacket and pull out a slim access card. The subcontractor's pass we'd logged in the entry records weeks ago. The magnetic reader blinked red, then green. The door gave under her push, and she disappeared inside without looking back. 30 seconds later, another figure entered the frame, Ethan. He stood just outside the threshold, not crossing in. His stance was casual, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other holding a phone to his ear. His head tilted slightly, as though he was listening to someone in real time. Every so often, his lips moved, short bursts like he was reading off a string of numbers. Lopez's voice came in my earpiece, low and steady. Audio confirms, coordinates. He's feeding the drop location to the buyer. My grip on the edge of the bench tightened until my knuckles ached. I could almost hear the cadence of his voice in my head, even through the muffled transmission. The brother who once whispered jokes to me in the chow line at boot camp was now calmly handing over what he thought was classified movement data, our ghost file, to a foreign contact. From the opposite side of the grid, the NCIS team leader reported in Korean to the KNP unit, staged in a disguised delivery van. The reply came crisp and affirmative. The noose was ready to draw. "Stand by, Mark," DOJ's field coordinator said, and the plan shifted from surveillance to arrest. Two black SUVs rolled from their positions at the north and west intersections, silent until the last 20 feet, when the crunch of tires on gravel broke the morning stillness. At the same time, a K&P tactical pair emerged from the alley's blind corner, their movements fluid, unhurried, like part of the street itself. Ethan had just turned his head toward the sound when the first agent reached him. The move was clean, one hand to control the phone, the other sliding the cuffs over his wrist with no wasted motion. The ratcheting click of the double lock was sharp in my ear, a punctuation mark that sent a pulse of cold through my chest. Inside the warehouse, Tara didn't have the benefit of surprise. The second she stepped out from behind a stack of pallets and saw the NCIS badge, her hand twitched toward her bag. The lead agent was faster. He caught her wrist, pivoted her to the wall, and in the same motion, the steel closed around her. No shouting, no struggle that lasted more than a heartbeat. Just the quiet, decisive sound of years of training in motion. The soft thud of boots repositioning, the faint clink of gear, the whisper of Velcro straps being secured. Lopez's voice broke the silence in my earpiece. Targets secure, no civilians in play. Moving to transport. I exhaled slowly, only then realizing how long I'd been holding my breath. On the monitor, Ethan's face was angled away from the camera, but I caught a glimpse as he was guided toward the SUV, a flash of something I couldn't name. Not defiance, not fear, something older, more tired. For a second, I wanted to ask for a hold, to walk up to him myself and demand to know why. But the operation was moving, and in the rhythm of a joint arrest, hesitation has no place. The feed cut to black as the transport doors closed. The van's engine rumbled to life, and we pulled out of the shadowed street into the pale light of morning, leaving the blue-signed warehouse and its secrets behind. The vertical spike had landed, and though the cuffs were on someone else's wrists, the weight of them felt heavy on mine. The convoy rolled back into the secured motor pool, engines ticking in the cool air. I stepped out of the surveillance van and felt the weight of every eye on me. The operation had gone exactly as planned. No injuries, no collateral, but the air was thick with something far heavier than relief. Inside the briefing room, the buzz was already rising. People stood in small clusters, arms folded, voices low but sharp enough for snippets to carry. The DOJ team filed out first, their focus already shifting to processing and chain of custody protocols. That left just our unit and the CID liaison. And that's when the temperature in the room shifted. Captain Morris was the first to speak, his jaw tight, eyes flicking from me to the door where Ethan had been led out in cuffs less than an hour ago. Olivia. Was this coordinated with command? His tone wasn't curious, it was accusatory, the kind of question that didn't really seek an answer but wanted a confession. I kept my voice even. The op was cleared through DOJ CI and coordinated with CID. Everything went through proper channels. Proper channels, Sergeant Ellery muttered from the corner, that somehow didn't loop in the rest of us until the takedown. He shook his head, not hiding the bitterness. Family matters. Are you sure? The phrase landed like a challenge. Not just are you sure you did the right thing, but are you sure you didn't just burn your own blood to look clean in front of outsiders? A couple of the younger techs exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of unease and curiosity. One of them, Specialist Reiner, didn't bother lowering her voice. Feels like she went behind the unit's back. Feels like betrayal. The word hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I'd spent my entire career in this community. We prided ourselves on trust, on never leaving a teammate in the dark unless absolutely necessary. But this wasn't about trust between operators. It was about national security. And the truth doesn't care whose last name it shares. I forced myself to keep my posture steady, hands relaxed at my sides. Data doesn't lie, I said, letting the words hang in the air. No anger, no defensiveness, just the simple statement of fact. The room went quieter, but it wasn't agreement. It was the kind of silence that comes when no one wants to say what they're thinking in front of a recorder. Somewhere in the pause, my mind slipped backward. I was 13 again. The rain coming down in a steady sheet that turned the yard into a patchwork of mud and puddles. Ethan and I sat on the porch, our boots caked, each of us holding an old rag as we worked the grime off our shoes. He was 17 then, taller but still gangly, his elbows knocking against mine as he teased me for taking too long. "Come on, Liv. You've got to treat the leather right," he'd said, brushing with short, careful strokes. "You keep your gear in shape. It'll take care of you." We'd laughed, flicked mud at each other, the smell of wet earth and saddle soap thick in the air. In that moment, there was no space for suspicion or strategy, just the simple bond of shared chores and an unspoken promise that we'd always look out for each other. Now, standing in this room, I could almost feel the weight of that memory pressing against the reality in front of me. That boy on the porch wouldn't have handed over sensitive movement data to a foreign contact, but the man in the alley outside the warehouse had. Morris stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that it was still audible to those nearby. "You know this is going to follow you, right? People don't forget when blood gets spilled, figuratively or otherwise." I met his gaze. "Then let them remember it correctly." He studied me for a long beat before turning away, signaling the end of the exchange. The CID liaison broke the tension with a dry, procedural reminder. "Statements will be taken individually. Chain of evidence review starts in 30 minutes. People moved, but the undercurrent remained, a slow, deliberate current of doubt that I could feel even when no one was speaking. As I gathered my notes, the murmurs started again, quieter this time, but still cutting through. "Family matters. Are you sure?" I didn't answer them aloud. My reply was the same one I'd already given, to myself, to anyone who asked, to the memory of the boy on the porch. Data doesn't lie. And if I'd been wrong, the consequences would have been mine to carry alone. The next morning, the air at the joint security area was unnervingly still. The DMZ has its own kind of silence, a layered quiet that hums with the tension of decades. Even inside the reinforced conference hall, you could feel it. The walls were painted a bureaucratic green, but the windows looked out toward the razor wire fence, the watchtowers, and the expanse of land that served as both barrier and reminder. We sat in a semicircle, the long conference table stretching between us. A 4-star general from U.S. Forces Korea sat at the head. His uniform was immaculate, his ribbons catching the morning light. Papers were laid out neatly in front of him, but I knew most of what he had to say wouldn't come from the pages. Ethan was seated across from me, his posture disciplined but rigid, like a man holding his breath. He wore his service uniform, creases sharp, collar perfect, but there was a tightness in his jaw that betrayed him. He glanced my way once, but it wasn't the look of a brother searching for understanding. It was the look of a man calculating what could still be salvaged. The general lifted his pen, twirled it once between his fingers, then set it down with deliberate precision. His gaze fixed squarely on Ethan. "We know everything." The words landed like a controlled detonation. No raised voice, no theatrics, just a statement so absolute it didn't need elaboration. The air seemed to thin. Around the room, the CID officer, the NCIS rep, and the DOJ-CI liaison remained still, their expressions neutral but watchful. Ethan's face barely moved, but I saw it, the smallest flicker in his eyes, like the moment a pilot realizes the warning light isn't a glitch. He didn't speak right away. When he finally did, his voice was low, edged with defiance. "You've been fed lies." The general didn't even blink. "We have your access logs, your communications metadata, your presence on surveillance feeds in restricted locations, and the recovered materials from Busan. This isn't a misunderstanding, Captain Carter. This is a matter of law and of national security." The formality of Captain Carter instead of Ethan was another cut, subtle but deep. It told him that this was no longer family, no longer camaraderie. It was protocol. 2 military police officers stepped forward, their movements precise, hands resting on their belts. Ethan's head turned slightly, scanning the faces in the room, maybe searching for one person who might still speak in his defense. But no one did. His eyes found mine, and for a fraction of a second, the DMZ, the general, the whole room fell away. It was just us, 2 kids on a porch, mud on our boots, laughing about nothing. That memory flashed in his gaze before something colder settled in. "You ruined me," he said. Not loud, not whispering, just a statement, heavy and final. I didn't flinch. My voice stayed level. "No, you ruined yourself. I just took notes." A muscle in his cheek twitched. For a moment, I thought he might lunge into an explanation or a plea or even an apology. But instead, he let out a short, humorless laugh, more like an exhale through clenched teeth, then stood when the MPs motioned for him to rise. They cuffed him quietly, no metal snap, no drama, just the sound of a pen scratching on a clipboard as the CID officer recorded the time. As they led him toward the door, he looked back once, not at the general, not at the evidence spread across the table, at me. It wasn't a look of hatred exactly, more like someone trying to memorize a final image before the door shuts for good. The MPs escorted him into the corridor, their boots striking in perfect unison. The door clicked shut behind them, and the room seemed to exhale. The general leaned back slightly, scanning the faces around the table. This concludes the internal phase of the operation. From here, military justice will proceed according to statute. Captain Carter will be remanded to legal counsel. He paused, as if to let the reality settle in. Dismissed. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as people rose. The DOJ liaison gave me a small nod, not congratulatory, not sympathetic, just an acknowledgement that the job was done. I gathered my notebook, the same one that had held weeks of careful observations, dates, and times. The same one that would now be evidence in a trial I never wanted to see happen. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine from beyond the fence. I could see the MPs walking Ethan toward a waiting vehicle, their silhouettes framed against the stark lines of the DMZ. I didn't watch him get in. I'd already seen enough endings to know when to turn away. They placed me in a viewing room divided from interrogation by a one-way pane, a sheet of glass that turns people into shadows until the light shifts and reminds you they are only human. Ethan sat at a metal table, wrists free, posture squared, a cup of water leaving a damp ring on gray paint. Tara was down the corridor with a different team and a separate recorder. DOJ led. CID took notes. An NCIS counsel watched the clock and the chain of custody. The first hour was procedural. Counsel confirmed rights. The mic light turned red. The interviewer built a timeline from badge swipes, camera stamps, and call logs. Ethan answered in clipped phrases. Yes, no, not to my knowledge. Then finally, I will explain. His voice was low, not broken. Measured like a man unpacking a bag he crammed the night a storm hit. He started with the debt. 2 years earlier, he bought into a private placement from a graduate school friend. A logistics startup promising guaranteed returns from government contracts that never materialized. When the market tightened, the friend vanished. The debt did not. He refinanced a condo, surfed balances between cards, told no one because pride is a quiet architect that builds rooms without windows. Tara entered 6 months later, not through a mystery parking garage, through a standard briefing rotation. She noticed he fielded calls through lunch, that he stared at spreadsheets after hours. She brought coffee and a contact who could restructure obligations. She used the word bridge. She called it temporary. The first payment arrived on the same day a collector threatened suit. He promised himself he would repay after the next promotion. He promised himself the storm would pass. Then came the ask. Nothing sensitive, she said. Just background on routine schedules, so her team could anticipate support load. No names, no sources, nothing that would hurt anyone. He sent one calendar extract and waited for the floor to open. It did not. The next week, she asked for a redacted movement memo. She sent a template. He clipped 3 lines and told himself he had shared nothing an ally could not infer from public chatter. He said the sentence he never should have said. It was not important. The interviewer let that sit, then slid photographs across the table. Ethan at the warehouse threshold with a phone to his ear. The subcontractor badge log under Tara's name at 23:14 hours. The preserved email from the overflow inbox with the ghost file. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. He did not deny. He said the asks kept moving, each time small, each time only once more, each time paired with a payment labeled consulting. Each time the knot pulled tighter. Through the glass, I watched his hands. He held them flat. Now and then his thumb twitched toward his ring and stopped halfway, as if even habit had learned to be ashamed. Asked why he continued, he said the truth I hoped and feared to hear. I was afraid, and I believed I could thread the needle and step away clean. Counsel pressed for mitigation. He did not paint Tara as a movie villain. He called her precise and patient, kind in the way predators are kind when they want you calm. She never threatened. She never had to. The debt spoke in a voice he could not ignore. Asked if he considered reporting, he said he drafted an email and deleted it. That he rehearsed the sentence in the mirror and could not carry it past his teeth. They asked about me. He stared at the glass. He knew how these rooms work. He knew I was there. He said he never aimed harm at me, that he steered around my projects, that he kept his sin narrow to keep me clear. He exhaled and said the line I will hear in every quiet room I enter. I thought I could shield her by being careful while I fell. When DOJ paused the session, a marshal set a blank page and a pen in front of him. Ethan wrote without lifting his eyes, then signed. He told the agent the note was for his sister, if permitted. The page came to me through a chain of hands, evidence first, then personal. Under fluorescent light, I read numbers and dates and names. No excuses. Near the end, he wrote one sentence that was not a datum. I hope you run faster the moment you feel the knot start to cinch. The porch returned. Muddy boots, the rag, the way he once said a good knot is a quiet promise. Now the promise had inverted. A warning sent backward through time. The team resumed. Ethan cooperated. I listened. Truth held. Lopez found me in the corridor outside the secure conference room, his expression carrying that tightness I'd come to recognize. A mixture of duty and the awareness that the next few minutes would leave a mark. He held a sealed evidence envelope, thick enough to be more than a single page, light enough that it couldn't be anything but paper. From Ethan, he said quietly, cleared for you to read, under chain of custody. You'll need to sign for it. Inside, there was a letter in his handwriting, precise block print, the kind we were both drilled on years ago in field reports. The date at the top matched the morning after his formal statement. No greeting, no soft entry. Just the first line. I take full responsibility for the breach and its consequences. My eyes moved down. He detailed the route of the funds, each intermediary account, every shell transfer, the foreign clearinghouse that funneled the payments. It wasn't a confession written for sympathy. It read like an after-action report intended to leave no gap for interpretation. Midway, he named the intermediaries, all spelled correctly, dates cross-referenced with wire timestamps. He circled in on the conduit, an account held under a minor corporation registered in Singapore, nominally for trade in machine parts, in reality a pass-through for Terra's network. I'd seen fragments of that name in DOJ intel reports. Now it was here, spelled out in a way that met evidentiary standard. Then the paragraph that shifted the air in my lungs. The junior analyst I tasked with compiling the redacted memos acted under my direct orders and with incomplete information. She did not know the end user. I request she be granted immunity from prosecution and disciplinary action. It was the one line where his letters looked heavier, as if he had pressed harder into the paper. There was nothing about forgiveness for himself, nothing that resembled a plea for me to see him differently. The closest he came to personal was in the final section. I ask only one non-operational favor. Keep our mother's name out of the record. She has no part in this. She doesn't deserve to read her name in connection with this in the papers. I could picture him writing that, the way he used to guard any mention of her, even in casual conversation. I read it twice before looking up. Lopez stood a pace back, giving me space, but watching for the signal to either return the letter to evidence or let me carry it to the next step. He gave this willingly, I asked. Lopez nodded. No counsel push. Said it was his last way to make something right. I signed the chain of custody form, my pen scratching over the page in the sterile quiet. When Lopez handed me the acknowledgement sheet for the enclosed intel, my hand didn't hesitate. I wrote my initials and then my full signature on the formal declaration, confirming I had received, reviewed, and verified the contents for operational use. That signature was the trigger that allowed the immunity clause for the analyst to be processed. The decision wasn't tactical, it was moral. That young analyst's career, and possibly her life, would have been dismantled by a prosecution she didn't earn. Ethan's request was the only part of the letter that sounded like the boy who once passed me his gloves during a freezing drill, saying he could handle the cold better. The vertical spike came in that moment, sharp, unexpected, the kind that doesn't fade when you exhale. I realized I was doing exactly what he asked, not because he deserved it, but because the innocent did. The letter closed the loop between what he had destroyed and what he could still protect. I placed the document back into the evidence envelope and sealed it under Lopez's supervision. As the tape pressed down, I thought about the strange balance of justice, how even in the wreckage of a betrayal, there can be one act that resists the pull toward complete ruin, and how sometimes signing your name can be less about loyalty to blood and more about loyalty to the truth that no one should be collateral damage. When Lopez took the envelope away, the weight in my hands was gone, but the mark it left on my thoughts wasn't. Ethan's words were now part of the official record and part of mine. I remembered the smell of pine and damp earth from that field exercise years ago, when the rain had been coming down for 2 straight days and morale was lower than our rations. We were both soaked through, mud caked to our boots, steam rising off our gear when we stopped for the first real break in hours. My hands were stiff with cold, fumbling at the zipper of my pack, when Ethan sat down beside me without a word. He unwrapped the sandwich he'd been saving, 2 slices of bread pressed flat by the weight of his pack, a smear of peanut butter and a sliver of jelly, and then, without hesitation, tore it in half, except it wasn't really half. He handed me the larger piece, the one with the thicker spread, the one he'd instinctively kept warm against his chest. "You need it more," he'd said, as if my exhaustion was somehow more important than his own. I remember chewing slowly, feeling the grit of sand between my teeth, knowing that the gesture was more than calories, it was solidarity. In those moments, kindness felt like armor against the cold. That memory rose up now, uninvited but unshakable, as I sat alone in the temporary quarters after reading his letter. The Ethan in that memory didn't fit neatly with the Ethan who had just detailed offshore accounts for an espionage investigation. They were both real, and that was the hardest truth to hold. A person can be capable of both the gesture that keeps you warm in the rain and the decision that puts your career and lives at risk. We like to think in absolutes, good or bad, loyal or treacherous, but service teaches you early that absolutes are a luxury. Most people live in the middle ground, their better selves wrestling with their worst impulses. Ethan had been my ally in mud and cold, my rival in the firing range, my quiet competitor in mission planning. He had also crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Those things weren't contradictions. They were coexisting facts. I leaned back in the chair, letting the memory and the present blur together. I could still see him under that tree, rain dripping from the brim of his cap, pushing the bread into my hand. I could also see him across the table at the DMZ meeting, eyes flat when he said, "You ruined me." Both images were honest. Both were him. Understanding that didn't make the betrayal easier. It didn't soften the consequences or erase the damage. But it stopped me from reducing him to a single act. In the field, we were taught to gather every piece of intel before making a judgment. This was the same, intel of a different kind. The file on Ethan Carter contained both the man who shared his last meal and the man who shared classified data with the wrong hands. The acceptance came slowly, like cold seeping through gloves. I didn't forgive him. Forgiveness wasn't what this was. It was an acknowledgement that the past we had didn't vanish just because of the future he chose. I could carry both without letting one erase the other. That balance, recognizing the full weight of his actions while holding on to the truth of who he had also been, was the only way forward that didn't twist me into something smaller. By the time I stood, the rain memory had faded back to where it belonged, not erased, just placed beside everything else. In my line of work, clarity often came from recognizing patterns. The pattern here was human, complexity, contradiction, and the capacity to be both the shelter in a storm and the storm itself. I could live with that truth, even if I couldn't change it. 6 months later, the dust had settled enough for me to make the request I'd been holding on to since the final report closed. I walked into my commanding officer's office with the form already signed and the words already prepared. I was stepping away from foreign liaison work, not because I couldn't do it anymore, but because I knew the cost of staying. Every time I sat at a table across from a potential partner nation, I would hear echoes, Ethan's voice, Tara's careful pauses, the weight of what had happened in Busan. It wasn't hesitation, it was clarity. The reassignment came quickly. I moved to a quieter corridor of the base, where the offices overlooked a gravel training yard instead of a secured parking lot. My new role was focused on training tactical observation for humanitarian negotiation teams, a skill most people underestimated until they needed it. It meant fewer diplomatic dinners, fewer classified handoffs, and more time in the field with people who were still learning how to see, really see, what was happening around them. On my first day in the new position, I arrived before dawn. The air was sharp with winter cold, the kind that burned your lungs and made you grateful for movement. I set up the yard with a few staged scenarios, actors moving in and out of view, subtle hand gestures to signal intent, the kinds of tells you'd miss if you were busy looking for the obvious. The recruits arrived in pairs, most of them younger than I'd been when I first met Ethan. Their eyes were alert, but their movements betrayed the inexperience of people who had yet to learn that observation isn't about staring, it's about noticing. Halfway through the session, one of the newer recruits tripped on the loose gravel while trying to keep his eyes locked on his subject. He muttered a curse, and I called him over. From my gear bag, I pulled out a pair of worn tactical boots. They weren't mine. They were a training pair I'd kept aside for moments like this. Heavy enough to anchor you, flexible enough to move fast. I handed them to him without explanation at first, watching the confusion on his face. Then I said it. The same words Ethan had once used in a moment that had nothing to do with betrayal or classified files. You want to be able to run faster when you feel the rope start to tighten. I didn't explain the rope. I didn't need to. The lesson was about awareness, knowing the difference between standing your ground and recognizing when the ground beneath you is no longer safe. The recruit nodded, not fully understanding, but storing the phrase away like a riddle. That was fine. Some lessons take time to land. I watched him lace the boots, his fingers quick but deliberate, and I thought about how knowledge passes forward in ways we don't always control. Ethan's words had reached me in one context, and now we're moving on in another, stripped of their original weight, but still carrying their truth. The rest of the session flowed easily. I moved between groups, pointing out missed details. A shadow in the wrong place, a repeated gesture that wasn't nervousness but signal. A shift in stance that meant someone was ready to leave before the conversation was over. Observation was never about just one sense. It was about connecting all of them into a map you could trust. By the time the recruits left, the yard was quiet again. Boot prints scattered in looping, messy trails across the gravel. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold, feeling the absence of the tension that had defined my last year in liaison work. It wasn't freedom exactly, but it was a different kind of service, one where I could still protect the mission without carrying the constant burden of second-guessing the people beside me. As I locked up and headed inside, I realized I wasn't leaving Ethan behind. I was simply putting him where he belonged. Part of the history that shaped how I teach, how I notice, and how I decide when to stay and when to run. There's a certain stillness that comes when you watch someone else recognize a sign you once had to learn the hard way. Weeks into my new assignment, I saw it happen during an advanced observation drill. One of my trainees, a quiet but razor-focused woman named Jensen, froze mid-exercise. She didn't break eye contact with her target, but I caught the slight shift in her stance. She leaned back, not retreating, just recalculating, like she'd picked up on something subtle. When the drill ended, she came to me and said, "I don't know why, but I felt the setup wasn't right. The timing of his movements was off." I didn't tell her she'd just caught the same kind of irregularity that, years ago, I'd missed until it was almost too late. Instead, I asked her to walk me through every detail she'd noticed. The way she broke it down, posture, pacing, a glance too calculated to be casual, was almost word for word what I would have said. I felt an unexpected wave of relief. The kind that loosens something in your chest you didn't know was still clenched. The knowledge had landed. The rope metaphor was no longer just mine to carry. That night, walking back to my quarters, I thought about how many moments in the past year had been defined by strain, suspicion, and the constant pull between duty and loyalty. Now watching someone else detect the earliest threads of danger, I felt lighter. It wasn't about vindication. It wasn't about proving I'd been right. It was about knowing that what I'd endured and what I'd learned wasn't going to end with me. When I look back now, the bitterness that once sat in my gut like a stone is gone. In its place is something sharper but cleaner, Clarity. I see the past for what it was, not for what I wish it could have been. Ethan was both the man who once split a sandwich with me on a cold training day and the man who made choices that dismantled trust piece by piece. Both truths coexist, and neither cancels the other out. Clarity doesn't mean forgetting. It means you stop carrying the weight in ways that slow you down. You learn to set it down where it belongs, in memory, not in your hands. That's what I tell my trainees when they struggle with the idea that people can change in ways that hurt us. You don't have to choose between the good they were and the harm they did. You just have to see both without letting either blind you. During our final training of the month, Jensen caught another anomaly, a subtle one, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't actively looking. I watched her signal her partner without hesitation, the same way I once wished someone had signaled me. The rest of the class followed suit, adapting on the fly. When it was over, she walked past me with the faintest smile, not one of pride, but of understanding. That was the moment the circle closed, not because my work with her was done, but because I knew the cycle of awareness was alive and moving forward. I left the yard that day without the familiar knot of tension in my shoulders. No lingering what-ifs, no mental replay of past failures. Just a steady, unshakable knowledge that I had passed something on that could keep someone else from standing where I once stood. On the wrong side of a tightening rope, too late to move, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. I keep my old leather-bound notebook in the bottom drawer of my desk, tucked beneath a stack of blank training logs. The cover is worn to a softness that only years of handling can give. The corners rounded, the spine barely holding together. It has been my constant companion through deployments, negotiations, investigations. Everywhere the job took me, the notebook came too. That morning, after the last training cycle ended, I pulled it out for the first time in months. The pages smelled faintly of dust and faint ink. My handwriting, jagged from cramped conditions or smoothed from quiet rooms, traced the arc of years I can't quite believe I lived. I turned to the very last page, the one I'd left empty on purpose, knowing I'd someday have something final to add. The last entry before the blank space read, "Traitors always think they're the smartest in the room." I remember when I wrote it, after one of the longest days of my career, sitting alone in a dim office with only the hum of a desk lamp for company. It had been a cold truth, sharpened by betrayal and made heavier by the face attached to it. Back then, I thought that line was the closest thing I'd ever get to closure. But staring at it now, I felt something shift. The sentence was still true, but it wasn't the whole truth. I picked up my pen and in a slower, steadier script, added beneath it, "But sometimes, they're also the ones who once carried you across the river." The ink bled slightly into the page, like the words wanted to root themselves deeper than the surface. I sat there a long time, letting the two sentences sit together, the condemnation and the concession. The contradiction was real, and it didn't cancel itself out. Ethan had been both, and that was the lesson I needed to leave in my own hand, that we don't erase the past, but we can choose not to let it poison what comes next. I closed the notebook, my thumb resting for a moment on the cover before sliding it back into the drawer. In my line of work, the temptation to live in absolutes is strong. Us versus them, right versus wrong, loyalty versus betrayal. But people don't fit neatly into boxes, and neither does the truth. Holding both sides without letting either one swallow the other, that's harder. That's the real work. Before we say goodbye, I want to leave you with the same thought I left my trainees that day. You cannot rewrite the past. You cannot undo what was done, or make someone into the version of themselves you needed them to be. But you can stop the past from deciding your future. That power is always yours, even when it doesn't feel like it. I thought of the people who'd come and gone in my life, the ones who'd stood beside me in mud and fire, and the ones who'd quietly pulled threads loose until the whole fabric came apart. Both had shaped me, both had made me sharper, more aware, more intentional. And if you're watching this, wherever you are, whether it's a quiet morning with coffee in your hands or a late night where the room feels just a little too still, I hope you remember this. Sometimes the miracle doesn't come crashing through your door. It waits quietly, patient, until you're ready to open your heart again. And when you do, it will change the way you carry everything that came before. Some habits don't change. I still prefer to sit one row back from the front, whether it's in a briefing room, a lecture hall, or the corner of a field exercise. It's the vantage point where you can see more than just the speaker. You can see the reactions, the whispers, the shifting of shoulders that betray unease. I still keep a pen in hand, still jot quick notes in shorthand, only I can fully decipher. But now, the purpose of those notes is different. They aren't ammunition for a report, or evidence to lock away in a classified file. They're anchors for lessons I can pass to someone else so they won't have to learn them in the hardest way possible. On a bright Tuesday morning, sunlight poured through the training center's high windows, striping the floor in long, warm bands. My new group of trainees filed in, their chatter low but their energy focused. I watched them take their seats, eyes clear, not yet shadowed by the weight of certain truths. As I started the session, I told them about the rope metaphor, the same one Ethan had once used, though I didn't give them his name. Sometimes danger doesn't come at you head-on, I said. Sometimes it starts like a rope around your ankles, so loose you barely feel it. But with every step, every choice, it tightens. The earlier you recognize it, the better your chance to get free. They leaned forward, scribbling notes, the same way I once did. One young man in the second row met my gaze with a look that told me he understood exactly what I meant. That look alone was worth every scar I carried. By the end of the day, I felt that familiar hum in my chest, the one that comes not from adrenaline, but from knowing you've just handed someone a tool they might one day use to save themselves or someone else. That's how you close a circle without cutting it off. That's how a mission changes shape but doesn't end. Looking out over the room, bathed in the glow of the morning sun, I knew my work was still unfolding. The past had been written, yes, but its value depended on what I did with it now. My story wasn't about the betrayal anymore. It was about what I built in its aftermath. Wherever you're watching from, whether it's dawn breaking outside your window or the quiet hours before you turn in, I hope you carry this with you. You don't have to let what hurt you define you. You can take it, reshape it, and hand it to someone else's protection. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time here with me today. And wherever you are, I hope you remember this. Sometimes the miracle doesn't knock. It just waits until you're ready to see it, pick it up, and pass it on. That's how we keep the light moving forward.